I didn't tell anyone I was hiking alone. It was supposed to be a weekend for me to escape, clear my head and disconnect. I'd picked a remote trail through a stretch of untouched forest, far enough from any major trailhead that I could go for hours without seeing another soul. Perfect solitude. But by the end of the first day, I realized I'd wandered too far. The trees were ancient here, trunks twisted and gnarled, towering so high they blocked out most of the sunlight. Shadows stretched long across the ground even in the early afternoon. As I pushed deeper, the silence started to weigh on me. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, unnatural quiet that I couldn't shake. Still, I pushed forward, determined to enjoy my retreat. Around sunset, I found a small clearing to set up camp, but the longer I stayed, the more I felt like something was wrong. It started with a feeling of being watched, that unmistakable sensation crawling down my spine. I tried to brush it off as nerves, but then I noticed something odd, a faint smell like rotting leaves, earthy and decayed, lingering in the air. I turned my head slowly, and in the dimming light, I caught sight of a figure at the edge of the trees. It was tall and thin, blending almost seamlessly into the darkness, just standing there, watching me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast silence. The figure didn't move. I felt my stomach drop, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But the camp was set, and I'd have to hike for miles in the dark to find another spot. So, trying to ignore the icy feeling in my gut, I ducked into my tent, zipped it tight and lay there, heart pounding, straining to hear any sound outside. At some point I must have drifted off because I woke up to the sound of scratching. Just outside the thin fabric of the tent, something was clawing at the ground, slow and rhythmic, like nails scraping dirt. My blood ran cold. I lay there, paralyzed, listening to the scratch, scratch, scratch as it circled my tent, over and over. After what felt like hours, the scratching stopped. I didn't move, barely breathing, terrified that whatever it was still there, waiting for me. I listened, straining to catch any sound. Then, slowly, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. Nothing. The forest was empty. But the ground around my tent was disturbed, the dirt scraped in long, jagged lines that formed a circle. My heart hammered in my chest as I packed up, desperate to leave. As I hurried back to the trail, I looked back only once, catching a glimpse of the figure watching from the trees. Closer this time, its face hidden in shadow. I ran, and I didn't stop until I reached my car, breathless and drenched in sweat. When I finally looked back at the tree line, the figure was still there, its outline barely visible against the trees. They say the forest protects its secrets. I don't know who or what that figure was. All I know is that I'm never hiking alone again, alone. This happened 2 years ago, and to this day I'm not sure how I made it out. I was on a solo hiking trip in the Smoky Mountains. I'd done plenty of solo hikes before, and the isolation never bothered me. In fact, I loved it. It was early spring, still cold, but with enough daylight to get a good full day of hiking in. I was following a trail I hadn't tried before, one that led to an old fire tower on a mountain ridge. It wasn't a popular spot, so I figured I'd have it all to myself. The trail started off fine. Dense forest, muddy patches here and there, the occasional fallen tree to climb over. As I got further up, though, I noticed the woods were completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, just stillness. It was weird, but I chalked it up to the altitude and kept going. After a couple of hours, I reached the fire tower. It was a dilapidated wooden structure, half buried in moss and leaning to one side. There was a faint, strange smell around it, like burnt wood mixed with something metallic. I stayed to take a few pictures, but the silence and that smell started to get to me, so I headed back. About 20 minutes down the trail, I heard it. A loud crack like a branch snapping in half. I stopped, looking around, but didn't see anything. I brushed it off as a tree shifting in the wind and kept going. But then it happened again, closer this time. Another crack. And then another. It sounded like something, or someone, was breaking branches behind me, following me down the mountain. I tried to stay calm, focusing on the path ahead, But the noises kept coming, always just behind me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned around and there was nothing there, no animals, no people, nothing. Just the empty trail winding back up the mountain. That's when I noticed something odd. Along the side of the trail, pressed deep into the mud, were footprints, like someone had been walking the trail barefoot. They weren't mine, and they looked fresh, as if someone had been standing just a few feet behind me. I felt a chill run down my spine and hurried down the path, forcing myself not to look back. I was almost at the trailhead when I saw it, a figure standing just off the trail, half hidden behind a tree. It was tall, wearing dark clothes, with its face shadowed beneath a hood or hat. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched me. I don't know if I imagined it, or if my mind was playing tricks, but it felt like those same bare footprints had led to it. I ran the rest of the way to my car, locked the doors, and drove off as fast as I could. I don't know who or what I saw, and I don't know if anyone was really following me, but every time I hike alone now, I can't shake the feeling of being watched, and I never go back to the Smokies without telling someone where I'll be. I've been hiking for years, always solo. I never had any reason to be scared, until one trip changed that. Last fall, I decided to tackle a remote trail in the Pacific Northwest. It was miles away from the nearest town, and as soon as I parked, I could tell the place was rarely visited. The trail was overgrown, branches hanging low, and thick moss blanketed everything. It felt like stepping back in time, into a forest that hadn't been disturbed in decades. I'd been hiking for hours when I stumbled across something strange. A small clearing, tucked away behind a dense wall of trees, had what looked like an old campsite, long abandoned, but recent enough that I could still make out the shape of a tent flattened by the elements. There was an eerie calm to the place. As I looked around, I spotted something on the ground, an old, battered hiking boot, just one. The odd thing was that the boot was filled with rainwater, but there were no signs of anyone around. I took a few photos, telling myself it was probably just a leftover from a hiker who'd lost their gear. But as I turned back to the trail, I noticed something out of place. In the mud nearby were footprints, bare human footprints, as if someone had walked barefoot through the forest. They looked fresh, the edges sharp and undisturbed, leading deeper into the woods. I don't know why, but those footprints gave me an uneasy feeling. Still, I pushed forward, picking up the pace as the sun started to set. But not long after, I started hearing something, a faint rustling, then a snap of a branch somewhere behind me. I'd pause, listening, but the sounds would stop as soon as I did. Every time I'd start moving again, though, the rustling would resume, like someone was following me, always just out of sight. I was maybe a mile from the trailhead when I finally turned around and froze. Standing between the trees was a figure. I couldn't make out much detail, but I could see enough. Whoever it was stood motionless, just watching me. They didn't move closer, didn't make a sound, just stood there in the shadows. I didn't stick around to find out more. I ran the rest of the way to my car, practically throwing myself inside and locking the doors. As I pulled away, I looked back once more. The figure was gone, but the unsettling feeling stayed with me, like they'd been watching the whole time. When I got back home, I looked up stories about that trail, curious to see if anyone else had experienced anything strange. I found an article from years back about a missing hiker who disappeared on that same trail, never found, but a single boot had been recovered in the woods. A few summers ago, I went on a solo backpacking trip in the Ozarks. It was the kind of rugged, isolated trail I liked. Far from towns, crowded trails, and cell phone reception. The plan was to hike 2 days in, camp by a lake, and then head back. It was supposed to be quiet and peaceful, but from the very start, something about the place felt off. The first night, as I set up camp, I noticed the forest was dead silent. Not even a hint of bird song or rustling leaves. Just this thick, heavy quiet hanging over everything. But I brushed it off. I'd heard that some forest could be like that at night, especially remote ones. I settled in, drifted off, and woke up to a strange noise around 2 a.m. It was faint at first, just a low rhythmic tapping like someone drumming their fingers on a tree. I lay there, frozen, listening. The tapping continued, irregular but insistent, and it sounded like it was moving. Closer. I turned on my flashlight and pointed it toward the tent wall, hoping the noise would stop. It did for a second, and I could hear nothing but my own breathing. But then, to my horror, the tapping started up again, right against the tent fabric. I held my breath, not daring to move, convinced I was about to come face to face with some wild animal. But the tapping was too deliberate, too human. Slowly, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. In the moonlight, I saw what looked like a figure standing a few yards away, partially hidden by a tree. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a person, completely still, with their head tilted like they were watching me. For what felt like hours, neither of us moved. I was too afraid to call out, too afraid to even breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stepped back into the trees and vanished. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I packed up my things and practically ran back down the trail, looking over my shoulder every few steps. About halfway back, I spotted something lying in the middle of the trail, a small hand-carved wooden figure like a doll or an idol. It was crudely made, but the shape of it was unmistakable. It was a figure with its head tilted just like the one I'd seen outside my tent. I left it where it was and kept moving. To this day, I don't know who or what I saw, but I've never gone back to that forest. And I never hike alone without telling someone where I'm going. I'd always been drawn to the quiet, secluded trails deep in the mountains. The further from civilization, the better. That's why I chose the old Carson Ridge Trail, one that hadn't seen maintenance in years. The ranger at the station didn't recommend it. She even looked at me strangely when I asked about it, muttering something about the trail being forgotten. I set out early, alone, eager for the kind of solitude only an abandoned trail could offer. The first few hours were beautiful but uneventful. Just the crunch of my boots on leaves and the occasional rustle in the trees. But as I climbed deeper into the mountains, an odd feeling began to settle over me. There was a silence that seemed too deep. No birdsong, no insects buzzing. I told myself it was just the dense forest, that the trees absorbed the sound. But the air felt thicker, oppressive somehow, and then I heard it. A faint voice. I stopped, listening hard. It was coming from somewhere up ahead, distorted but unmistakable, like someone calling for help. I called back, but there was no response. Just silence. The logical part of me knew it could be an echo bouncing off the cliffs, but my gut twisted. It felt wrong. I pushed on, keeping my pace steady but wary. The trail grew harder to follow, and the trees seemed to close in, their shadows stretching and twisting in ways that made me shiver. Every so often I'd hear that voice again, closer this time and more desperate. Sometimes it sounded like a whisper in my ear, and I'd spin around, only to find nothing there. Around midday, I came across something that froze me in my tracks. Lying on the ground, half buried in leaves, was an old weathered backpack. The fabric was faded, and moss had begun to grow over it. It had been here a long time, but there were no signs of anyone nearby. Cautiously, I opened it, expecting it to be empty or filled with decayed supplies. Instead, it was stuffed with things that looked disturbingly familiar. A water bottle, a compass, a map with notes scribbled in the margins, notes that matched my own. My heart pounded. How could this be? I'd never been here before, but the handwriting was identical to mine. I dropped the backpack, staggering back, my mind racing for an explanation. I told myself it had to be some kind of elaborate prank, but deep down I didn't believe that. And then the voice came again. Louder, clearer. It was my own voice, calling out for help. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the forest, luring me off the trail, as if beckoning me toward something I couldn't see, against every instinct screaming at me to turn back. I found myself following it, my steps shaky but relentless. The further I walked, the more the landscape seemed to change. The trees twisted into unnatural shapes, their branches like bony hands reaching for me. The ground beneath my feet felt softer, almost spongy, like it wanted to pull me under. Finally, I reached a clearing, and there, in the center, stood me, or at least something that looked like me. It was hunched, shadowed, its eyes hollow and dark, mirroring every movement I made. When it spoke, its voice was my own, broken and desperate. Help me. It whispered. "I've been here so long." I stumbled back, heart racing, and turned to run. The trail seemed to close in around me, twisting and shifting so I couldn't tell if I was getting closer to the exit or deeper into the forest. Every time I looked over my shoulder, the thing that looked like me was closer, always a few steps behind, its voice growing louder. Finally, I burst through a thicket and found myself back on the main trail. Panting, I glanced back, but the clearing and the shadowy figure were gone. Only silence remained. I ran the rest of the way back to the trailhead, barely stopping to catch my breath. When I reached the ranger station, the same woman was there, watching me with a knowing look. "The forgotten trail has a way of finding you," she murmured. I didn't answer. I didn't want to know what she meant. All I knew was that I'd left something of myself in those woods, something that would forever echo, calling back for help that would never come.